So I'm going to talk about pre-analysis plans and pre-registration. And again, in the sort of RT2 roadmap, you see those sort of right on the top right there. These are activities that would take place often early in a research project. So they kind of fit at the beginning of this cycle, but as Sean will talk about, all these things are interconnected and sort of flow into each other. And I'm speaking about them partially because I've worked on this topic as well as them coming early in the research cycle. So what's the starting point? One of the things you'll hear about today, and I think one of the things that probably motivated a lot of you to come into this room in the first place, is the awareness that there really are a lot of problems with empirical social science research. There's more and more evidence that there's pervasive publication bias, that there's pervasive specification searching. There's been instances of fraud that have been pretty high profile in certain fields. And so putting all this together raised a lot of red flags and really motivated this movement towards open science. One of the sort of products of the movement, or one of the, I think, beneficial moves that we've seen as a result of the sort of research transparency and open science movement, is the move towards registration and pre-analysis plans in social science fields. So I'll talk a little bit about the background here. This is a potential solution for a number of problems, as I'll talk about. So in a piece that came out about 5 years ago, a number of co-authors and I laid out 3 potential approaches to begin to deal with publication bias, specification searching, these other concerns in the empirical social science literature. One is disclosure. So moving to have scholars disclose details of the research process, to have ethical disclosures, financial disclosures. This is an area where there actually has been a lot of progress in the last decade in the social sciences. Until about a decade ago, the social sciences were way behind medical research and disclosure. So my wife is a doctor, and anytime she presents, I remember being so struck by this. Whenever she would present slides, she'd have to have a whole disclosure slide with, I once received, a meal from this one pharmaceutical company, which used to be an investor in a technology that used to be linked to this thing that I'm talking about. I was like, wow, that's intense, because until a few years ago, in the American Economic Association journals, even if you had received money, you had been commissioned to write a paper by a financial institution, you didn't need to disclose it. So now that's changed. There are disclosure requirements that have been put in place just over the last decade in a lot of fields. But of course, disclosure goes beyond financial interest. We want scholars to disclose, all the treatment arms in their study. We want them to disclose, their research design. We want them to share their survey instruments. So disclosure is a lot broader than just financial conflict of interest. So that's one point. The second big kind of class of solutions is open data and materials. Of course, open data and materials are critical to allow for replication, and replication is critical to know whether results are robust. So open data and materials is another big trend, and there's been a lot more of a push by journals and funders to push for open data. I'm not going to talk about 1 and 2 that much here today, but other talks in the next few days will go into these themes. I will say, in the slides that Alex will post on OSF, based on our recent data where we're tracking open science practices, the open science practice that has gained the most traction in the last decade is open data. People are sharing data way more than they did a decade ago. So if you look at scholars a decade ago, at least in our data, something like 20-something% of them had ever shared their research data. And if you look at it today, over the last year, it's more like 3/4 have shared research data. So we've seen in basically a decade a shift from people almost never sharing their data in the social sciences to almost always sharing their data, at least some of their data in the open sciences. There's a long way to go. People may not share the raw data. They may only share some of the data, but there's been a sea change in open data. So again, these are areas where there's been progress. What I'm really going to focus on now for the next half hour is the third point here, pre-registration of research hypotheses. Another element of, in this sort of toolkit of solutions. And the idea here is if scholars share their research designs beforehand, it may have a range of benefits, which I'll talk about, and may actually help reinforce these other two practices in ways that I'll talk about. You're going to hear from Graham later about sort of a further step in specification and declaring design. So he's going to go into this in even tremendous detail. Fiona, who I think is back there, although I didn't see her. Is Fiona back there? You're really hiding over there. Okay. Fiona's also going to talk about pre-registration of observational studies. So I'm going to give you kind of like a teaser about pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, and then you're going to hear about lots of the latest kind of new work later on today. So this is just the beginning. Okay, so what is pre-registration? The idea is researchers can post their hypotheses and the data they're going to use, their models, their statistical models, in a publicly available registry before they do their analysis. When we think about the scientific process, like when we were all little kids and we first learned what science was, I think we thought of science in this way. Like, I have a hypothesis. Maybe we were even taught this is the scientific method. I have a hypothesis. Then I get the data. Then I test the hypothesis. Then I report the results. Feels very linear, feels very scientific. In practice, over the past however many decades, very little social science research actually followed that approach. It was more like people got the data, worked on the data for years, found lots of interesting correlations, and then reported those correlations. And that's pretty interesting. Discovering what correlations are in data is cool, but it definitely opens up the possibility of pervasive specification searching. And there's a fear that maybe those correlations, those unexpected correlations you documented in the data, are really false positives. That if you kind of dig enough, you'll find something really unusual and unexpected. The other concern with doing all this data mining and sort of the correlational analyses that we do, which again, we've all done and could be very useful in discovering new patterns. I'm not disparaging that, but there is a concern that we can no longer really interpret the p-values that come out of that analysis. Maybe I ran thousands of tests on the data before I got that one correlation I'm reporting in my paper. So unless you're doing a multiple testing adjustment, I have no idea what that p-value really means. So those are further concerns. I'm going to get into this more in a second. What I want to do is just walk you through the American Economic Association registry, just because it's my home field, but I'll also make links to some other registries in other fields that are pretty closely related. The establishment of the registry in economics was inspired explicitly by medical research, and in particular, clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov has been around for about 20 years. There are many hundreds of thousands of studies registered on clinicaltrials.gov, and the social sciences have sort of built on what was learned in medicine. So the AAA Registry is called Social Science Registry. It was founded about 6 years ago. It focuses on randomized controlled trials, which are sort of a growing share of research in economics and many other social science fields like political science. This is the registry. You go to this page, and it basically walks you through. You click on the Register a Trial button, and it's actually a very simple process. So I forget how many people are in psychology or a psychology-related field. So there's several people here working in psychology. In psychology, you may be familiar with the site As Predicted. How many people have heard of As Predicted? As Predicted is sort of a similar site in psychology for registration of hypotheses. As Predicted is not an association site. This has a little bit more weight in being the AAA site, but it's really taken off in terms of registration, As Predicted, and it's very simple. So the AAA registry is similar. Over the last 6 years, about 3,000 economics RCTs have been registered. The numbers are increasing pretty rapidly. Now, of these 3,000, some of them are older RCTs that donors and research organizations have asked their affiliates to post. And you'll see in a minute why that could be valuable. But most of them are new studies. So there's some combination of sort of like registration of studies from 10 years ago, as well as registration of new studies. And this is the data. So, in talking about are things changing, are norms changing, well, you can see in the left-hand panel is the cumulative number of studies registered. This is through May of this year. Since then, it's gotten actually close to 3,000. Here it's 2,600. And then what you see on the right is the number of studies registered per month. So it's not tailing off. It's like the number registered per month is rising. The number of RCTs being conducted at economics is rising, and they're being registered here on the registry. There was the good question before about kind of institutional change and our donors and other institutions sort of on board. In the last year, the American Economic Association now has mandated that any papers going forward that are submitted to the AAA journals, which are some of the leading journals in economics, need to be registered. So any RCT studies need to be registered. So they're already basically mandating that you take part in the registry. This is what medical journals did when clinicaltrials.gov was established too. They basically forced researchers. If you want to publish a clinical trial, you have to have registered on clinicaltrials.gov. Okay, so you can see registration is taking off. The AAA registry is actually pretty simple. These are all the fields, so there's not that many fields. You put the title of your study, the country, the status, is it ongoing or completed, some keywords, and then an abstract. So this is maybe a 200-word. I don't think it's, I forget if there's a limit, 200 or 300-word abstract. Some details about the dates, trial and end date, trial start and end date. I've bolded here some key points. Outcomes are listed. What are your basically primary outcomes, or what are called endpoints in some fields? What is the experimental design? What type of experiment are you running? Some basics about the design, clustering, number of clusters or sort of units, and then IRB approval. So this actually is pretty straightforward. You could register a study in theory. If you've already written a grant proposal, so you have something like an abstract, and you have basic details on your grant, there's no reason you couldn't register your study in an hour on the registry. So it's meant to be a pretty low bar, and as you can see, people are adopting it. So this is the AAA registry, and again, it's just click through kind of fields and super easy to do, which is as predicted. The site in psychology, the kind of parallel site in political science is the EGAP registry. How many people have registered or heard of the EGAP registry? So some of the political scientists. So EGAP also has a pretty streamlined, web-based registration. So again, it's become pretty easy across fields to register trials. Among the major social science fields, to my knowledge, I don't know of an equivalent sort of trial registry or study registry in sociology. I don't know if any of the sociologists know of one. My co-author on the book, Jeremy Fries, is a sociologist and claims there isn't an equivalent, but I don't know if any sociology students or faculty or anybody in the room knows of any change or progress.
Well, we don't do a lot of RCTs.
Yeah, that's right. I think the methods are a big part of the reason for the difference. Okay. So why might pre-registration be useful? Again, this is sort of a high-level conversation, and I'll get into some of the details, but Graham and Fiona will get into more. One of the real important points about registration is in what we call rounding out the body of evidence, creating some sort of paper trail of studies. Now, why could this matter? One of the major concerns in scientific research is publication bias. If you look at scientific fields, especially historically, it's starting to get better. Very few null results were published. Very few zero effect results were published. But I think people in their own work or anecdotally or in their own community knew there were a lot of null results floating around. They just weren't published. What a trial registry allows is for studies that were started and registered that may not have yielded a result that led to a publication to be identifiable, to be findable. So if I start a study, I register, but for some reason my results aren't published, you can still find me. You can try to reach out to me to get my results, to include them in a meta-analysis, to understand the body of research more broadly than just the published literature, again, which is a concern if we think there's publication bias. And it's not an idle concern. So this is a figure from a great recent paper by Franco et al., 2014, in Science. So this is one of my favorite papers in the open science literature over the last 5 or 6 years. This is a study that basically allows the authors to look in the file drawer, of sort of missing studies or null results that are never published. How do they do that? The NSF funded a series of studies across the social sciences, sociology, psychology, economics, political science, in what were called the TESS studies. Basically, researchers were allowed to add a few questions to a representative national sample of respondents. And there was a vetting process. I had to apply and say, look, I want to add these 3 questions. It went through peer review, and pretty high quality study questions and hypotheses then could be tested using data based on questions added to this regular online survey. Again, across the social science fields. So there were, I forget the exact number of studies, 221 studies funded this way. Franco et al. Got the data from NSF on all these applications, who the authors were, and then they reached out to them, I think 5 years later, to find out what had happened to their results. So, you said, you added these questions. We know you added these questions to the survey. You said you were going to run this test. What were the results? And they actually found that there's a big difference in the publication of results as a function of the statistical significance of those findings. If you look on the left, if you look at the main test in those original hypotheses, when results were strong, meaning p-value less than 0.05, probably in the expected theoretical direction, and you see what share of them are published, about over 60% are published, meaning paper in top journal or not top journal. A lot of them are in top journals, and almost all of them are written up. So maybe they were unpublished. These folks were trying to get their paper published, but the paper existed. It was being circulated in the research community. Significant results existed. Only a few percent of results were unwritten. Then there were mixed results, maybe marginally significant results, maybe some unexpected results. This doesn't look too bad. Again, the bulk of them are written up. Maybe only about 10% are not written up. You can already see maybe it's a little harder to get these papers published in top journals, but they exist. Then they look at the studies, about a quarter of the studies with null results. So I tested something. I wanted to find a relationship between variable A and variable B in the data. There was no relationship. 5 years later, what happened to these results? Again, leading social science researchers went through rigorous peer review, added data to this really high quality panel survey. Like, this is data that the world should be interested in seeing. Here, 2/3 are just never written up. No one has seen these results. They don't exist for the scientific community for the most part. Very few are published in top journals, etc. So null results are way less likely to be published than significant results. And this is just like a decade ago. This isn't 50 years ago. So publication bias is a real concern. Almost anything we can do to see more null results in our literatures is incredibly valuable for science. So this is what the registry can do. It lets us sort of find these missing studies, potentially. If you have a registry, you don't need to be like Franco et al. And get the donor to give you all the data. You can just find it on the registry. So that's great for meta-analysis. Okay, point 2. The existence of a hypothesis document that's registered may reduce the degree of data mining and other sort of biased reporting of results or cherry picking, because now there's some accountability. If I send this paper off to a journal, referees can pull my pre-analysis plan and say, wait a minute, you said you were going to test the effect of A on B, but now I don't see anything related to A and B in your paper. It's all C, D, and E. Like, I want to see A and B. I want to see those results. Data mining is a real concern. Specification searching is a real concern. And I think in practice, it's often worked around getting p-values below the 0.05 level in many fields. People feel this incredible attachment to significant results. And you can see this in data. So this is data from sociology journals and political science journals. And there's an exact similar looking figure for econ journals that is going to be in the slides that Alex will post. What we have on the x-axis here is the z-statistic. And the sort of z-statistic corresponding to p less than 0.05 is 1.96, so about a 2, I think, as we all know. And in field after field, in sociology, in political science, in economics, in other scientific fields, you see huge spikes in p-values at like 0.049. So there's no natural distribution of p-values that would yield that pattern. This is just clear evidence of some either publication bias and or specification searching. And again, this is data from about a decade ago, but you can look more recently and still see these spikes. So, making sure null results get published would help fill in some of the data here. It's important for that reason. But moving away from the fixation with p less than 0.05 is going to be very important culturally for all of us. All of us as scholars, when we review papers, if we're editors of journals, when we talk to our colleagues about results, have to stop fixating on significance levels. People have to report results from well-designed studies with good data, and regardless of what the results are, they're of value to the scientific community if it's a well-designed study. That has to be our mindset. When we talk to colleagues, about a paper, and someone says, how was that paper? Maybe don't lead with, yeah, they found a significant result on X. Maybe the way we should all be describing that paper is, they tackled this really important issue on electrification in India, and had this amazing nationally representative survey, and they were able to really assess the effect of this program. It was just such a well-designed study. That would be a nicer way, and I think a way that's more in line with scientific values than just fixating on what's significant in the paper. So anyway, that's maybe our challenge, or the cultural change that we should all see. Okay, so why might pre-registration be useful? Rounding out the body of evidence, reducing the risk of data mining, giving us statistical tests that we can actually interpret. So if you actually said you were going to run that one test and you get the data and you run that one test, I know exactly what that p-value means, hopefully. If I data mine for 2 years on a data set and I ran thousands of tests, I really don't know what any p-value means anymore, because I may just be sort of reporting false positives. Number 4, pre-registration makes open data and disclosure more effective, because now when I do get the open data, I can check it against your original plans. So these things all sort of reinforce each other. Number 5, I think this is an underappreciated benefit. Having worked on many pre-analysis plans at this point, working on pre-analysis plans up front, forcing yourself to put stuff on paper, being very careful about the econometrics, knowing you're gonna have to run this, you're gonna have to look at this analysis, I think it does improve the research. It makes people think things through up front. I've heard some backlash, in some lab-related research in economics. I know some experimental economists have pushed back against this, saying, well, it's onerous. We want to be able to have an idea and immediately jump into the lab and sort of test things right away. But, why not wait like a day? Write down your hypotheses first and then jump in the lab. You don't need to do it today. So I think it's important to be kind of disciplined and patient. Okay, what about others? Let me pause for a second, just open it up. We'll have open questions at the end, but what are some other potential benefits? And then I'll get to some potential costs, because there's kind of different sides of the equation. What are some benefits people can think of? Yeah.
Sometimes when you don't have enough time, or when you don't have time to think about all the design, then you can find that certain things might not be in compliance with one another, so that you can have a general idea of the whole proposal, and you can see whether they are whether they agree with one another.
So if you have more time to work through the pre-analysis plan, you can see how everything fits together more carefully. Yeah. So again, maybe improving the design or improving the research. Yeah. There was another hand up. Yeah.
I think also when working with students, I've had my mentees review pre-registration databases to make sure that they aren't looking at a question that's already in progress, so that they don't feel scooped, even though they're not being, you know what I mean? It's an opportunity cost. So we can pivot away from that particular question and move towards something so that there isn't a duplicate paper coming out simultaneously. It's the worst feeling in the world when a reviewer's like, oh, we just looked at this question, or,
right.
So.
That's right. So there's value, training value to it too. Yeah. Any other potential benefits or thoughts about upsides of plans? Yeah.
One of the readings mentioned the partnership with donors, and if you can get them on board with what you're planning to do, then they can't complain if they don't like the results. So it can kind of strengthen that partnership.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I kind of alluded earlier to this project in Sierra Leone that I worked on, where we found lots of null results. We had worked closely with our donor partners on the pre-analysis plan. We had shared it with them. They had sort of signed off on the outcomes we were looking at. They even suggested a bunch of other outcomes, which we added to the survey. And then when the results come in, it's a bit like, hey, we agreed this was the way to test it. So they were disappointed, but I think it did lead to maybe better understanding at the end of the day. Is there, another hand there,
So I think what it does is it allows you to do weird things without having people being suspicious of you after the fact.
Yeah.
So it actually can encourage exploration, which is the opposite of what we talk about pre-registration. So in some examples, we'll run a study that has 8 items.
Yeah.
And we want to run these other 2. We don't want them to be part of our analysis plan. We want them to be exploratory.
Yep.
But now that we have pre-registration, we'll include those items, and then everyone in the world can see that when we drop them for the analysis, we're not doing it in a way that is trying to get statistical significance into the plan in advance. So it protects you from any accusation of malfeasance after the fact.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. The note, again, when I come to sort of critiques, we'll come to this point, oh, do plans stifle creativity? But you emphasize that they could enhance creativity or encourage creativity because you can do something unusual, but you pre-specified it, you justified it up front. If you didn't do that and ex post you did something unusual, people would be suspicious. Are you only doing something unusual to get that p-value less than 0.05 or something like that? So actually it could encourage creative design. Yeah.
I think the pre-registration can go through the peer review process as well, so that you can get feedback from reviewers before you really conduct the study. That may improve your experimental design.
Yeah, that's great. So that's related to number 5, but even it goes beyond, and not just me thinking through it, but others can think through it. So some of us in this room have been to research meetings of a particular research network. I guess, Graham, you've been to Wagape meetings, and I forget several others in the room, but there's a research network called the Working Group in African Political Economy that economists and political scientists may be familiar with. And these days at those meetings, about half of the discussions at the meetings, and the meetings are really meant to improve the research of network members, give feedback, half of them are discussions of designs, of pre-analysis plans. So again, once you've really written down your plan, you can get feedback in a very structured way. And then I'll talk about sort of how they tie into the journal process in a few slides as well. Were there any hands in the area I can't see behind the wall there? No? Okay. Great. Okay, so these are some benefits. We'll talk about some other upsides. The leading concern, and this was already alluded to, is somehow pre-registration will stifle creativity. That somehow it'll stifle exploratory research. And I think the vision or the view people have in mind here is a world where now that we're writing down pre-analysis plans, that becomes all the analysis that we do. There's a plan, you carry out that analysis, and there's no more research. But the truth is, and having been involved in pre-analysis plans now for over a decade and being a referee, editor on many papers using plans, I think every single paper I've been involved in or seen, people go beyond the plan. They carry out the analysis in the plan, and then they say, hey, here's some additional analysis. Here's some stuff in the data that I found that's really interesting. I didn't pre-specify it, but it's worth reporting. And all of that is just like the stuff we would have reported in any other paper before there were pre-analysis plans. So there's no real loss to it. So I don't think it has to stifle creativity as long as we don't become so rigid in our thinking to think that the only thing of scientific value is what was pre-specified. That's really valuable, but lots of other analysis is valuable. And many scientific discoveries came through exploration. We should encourage that. We should get all the mileage we can out of our data, including exploring new correlations that could then stimulate the, sort of lead to the next project. So I think, that's really where we come down on, and I think most people in the field, what you just need to do is be very clear about what was pre-specified and what wasn't pre-specified. As long as you're clear about that, there's really no tension here. Historically, I think, and even today, in many social science papers, people present papers as if they had pre-specified their analyses. They write the papers like, here's my first hypothesis, here's the result, but they didn't pre-specify that hypothesis necessarily. Maybe they went through 50 hypotheses till they hit on that one, but then they're reporting it as if it were pre-specified. So, having pre-registration kind of frees us from that approach. Now it's clear what was pre-specified, it's clear what wasn't, and we can sort of judge the evidence based on that fact. Okay, what about the time costs and other concerns? It takes time to write a pre-analysis plan. Ben Olkin has written a piece, focusing on economics, saying, look, these are costly. These take a lot of time. There's an opportunity cost. Should we really be doing these? And he writes pre-analysis plans. He comes down on the side of like, yeah, we should be writing them, but he's concerned about the time cost. I think it does take time. I think anybody who's written a pre-analysis plan knows it takes time. What I've found in my own personal experience is it takes time up front, but writing a plan and doing that thinking up front saves you time on the back end. When the data comes in, actually you can write all your analysis code based on the plan while you're collecting the end-line data and produce results very quickly after data is collected to have that first set of pre-specified results. So there is some time saving on the back end. I do think overall, there probably is some increase in time that you need to put into a project because of a pre-analysis plan. But it's not as severe as it feels like it is up front because you have some time saving later on. There's another debate and question, and different fields are sort of evolving differently on this, about how detailed plans should be. So there's one view of the world, which is you should pre-specify literally every single thing that'll go in the paper, every table and just write the plan with, here are the 12 tables I'm going to present, here are the 5 figures I'm going to present, here's all the heterogeneity analysis I'll present, and if I find pattern A, then I'll do this sub-analysis B. If I find pattern C, I'll do sub-analysis D. Some plans have that flavor. I myself have written some very detailed plans. So sometimes researchers have gone down that road. In other cases, it's a little hard to specify that much detail. There may be a lot of branches in the tree that we can't foresee in terms of what the constellation of results will be. So I think the way it's evolving, at least in econ, and maybe people can speak to other fields, is even relatively simple pre-registration, specifying the main tests, the main outcomes, is actually really valuable. At least knowing what the core analysis is already gets us a lot of the benefits of pre-registration. And then anything beyond that won't have been pre-specified, but at least the core analysis will be. So in economics, at least, there's a lot of flexibility. Some people have short plans, some people have long plans. And it may depend on the project and the researcher. Sometimes we're rushing to the field. A project's going to start, end-line data is starting, and people may not have 3 months to write the fully detailed plan. Maybe they only have 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and then maybe plans are a little bit shorter. So I think there is a range of detail that could be useful, but even registering the basics is really valuable for the field. It's on the registry. We know what your primary outcomes were. People can search on that. And it does provide some accountability. That's my own take, but this is a little bit of a live debate right now. Maybe in the open discussion in a few minutes, we can see people's thoughts or reactions to this. Okay, a major question is how widely can we apply pre-registration? Actually, I realized looking at the time that I'm not going to be able to go through all this, but the great thing is Graham and Fiona are going to go through this in a lot of detail. They're going to expand on a lot of this later on. Laboratory experiments seem like a good place to do it. Observational studies, we may be able to apply pre-registration to some observational studies, but let me not talk about that because I think I only have another 5 minutes. And what I want to talk about is pre-results review. So let me jump ahead to that. You'll get all these slides, and you'll be in very good hands with Graham and Fiona in a few hours, getting into the details about how we can apply pre-specification. So let me skip over this. You see Fiona's name there, and okay, let me jump over here. Pre-results review has really taken off in psychology and cognitive science over the last 4 or 5 years. Pre-results review means papers are evaluated based on their research plan, effectively, not on the results. And again, the idea here is we want to judge research on its quality, not just on whether they have a couple of stars next to their p-value. And if we can evaluate research up front, we can do that. And when I've discussed this with economist friends of mine where this hasn't taken off yet or is just starting to take off, as I'll talk about, people have been a little skeptical, like, how can we do this? How can we evaluate research without seeing the results? And, I kind of have 2 responses. One is we already do this all the time when we review grant proposals. When we are reviewers on NSF panels, everything from, NIH NSF panels to student travel grants, we're like assessing the likely quality of this research. So we're already evaluating research before we can see the results. So it isn't that foreign, A. B, there is actually an interesting precedent. So let me just talk about this case in economics from about 20 years ago. There was a case 20 years ago of a pre-analysis plan and pre-results review in an economics journal that was sort of forgotten from the intellectual history, I think, until recently. We talk about it in the book. In the 1990s, there was a very contentious intellectual debate, which continues today, on the minimum wage, the economics of the minimum wage in the United States. And actually, some of the early rise of rigorous quasi-experimental methods in economics came in through this debate. Scholars were sort of bringing tools in from biostatistics and other fields into economics. Card and Kruger have famous work on this. And in the context of this debate and sort of, if you look at this later on, variation in point estimates across different studies, the question was, how can we reach some sort of consensus on the science? And an editor of a journal, David Levine at Berkeley, had hosted or sort of like provided the forum for pre-results review in a journal he was editing called Industrial Relations. The idea was the leading scholars in this debate could pre-specify the analysis they would run with data that hadn't yet come out. Basically, in 1996, 1997, there were a series of minimum wage increases that were already on the books. And then there were going to be data releases. And basically, he encouraged scholars in this debate to write down their analysis, have him review it, make sure it was good analysis, and then he would commit to publish the results regardless of the findings. So this is pre-results review. It happened a couple decades ago. And the goal was to have the evidence be free of author effects, because basically both sides in this debate were accusing each other of being biased. Some folks saying, you want to find that raising the minimum wage reduces employment, and then the other way, you want to find, increasing the minimum wage does nothing to employment. And they were kind of pointing fingers at each other, but if they could pre-specify a design with data that was not yet available, they couldn't data mine it, right? It wasn't yet available. So it's very much the kind of impetus for pre-analysis plans and pre-results review. It's very similar to the idea that Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, has called, who's a psychologist, has called adversarial collaboration. And again, for even further intellectual history, talking to David Levine, myself, he claims that the late Alan Kruger of Princeton actually was the first person to suggest this idea. So again, he was Alan Kruger, recently deceased, was a real giant of economics. So this is the intellectual tradition. So what they did is very close to what's called a registered report or pre-results review. And what I want to talk about is this format or this approach has really taken off in psychology, as I'll show you in a second, and is now starting to be adopted in economics. So what is pre-results review? Instead of the usual journal process, there's really two phases of the journal review process. There's a first phase called stage 1, where authors submit what's basically an extended pre-analysis plan. This is what I plan to do, but has a very well-defined and well-written front end of the paper, justifying the question, reviewing the literature, making the case for this analysis being interesting and important, and then laying out their planned analysis. That is then reviewed by the journal. There could be an R&R, revise and resubmit process, where they improve on their design ex ante. So this gets back to the point before of, if you write something up front, you can improve the design. Then once that, it could be rejected by the journal if they decide this isn't an interesting question, or it could be accepted. And what it's called is in principle acceptance. It's like a conditional acceptance from a journal. At that point, the authors go and collect their end-line data, they write up the paper, and then they submit the full paper, again, based on that stage 1 version, but now with results, and they interpret the results. And the idea then is there is another review round of review in the journal at that point, but the editors are committing to publish that paper as long as the interpretation of the results is reasonable. So, you ran the test you said you were going to run, you interpret it in a sensible way, we're going to publish it. We don't care if the results are what we expected, not what we expected, null results, we're going to publish it. And then, the paper eventually gets published. There could be maybe a revise and resubmit at that last stage if they say, hey, you have to revise the conclusion because I think, your conclusions aren't justified, something like that. This figure shows the rise of pre-results review and registered reports in psychology and other journals. You can look at the left-hand panel. The blue is psychology. You can see 5 or 6 years ago, no journals did this, and now lots of journals do it. Some medical journals are starting to do it. Top scientific journals like Science and Nature are starting to do it. So this article format has gone from non-existence to being pretty widespread. And the process of pre-results review, this is back to the minimum wage study, kind of has this same feel. There was the symposium where folks wrote up their analyses up front, the data was released, and then eventually they submitted their paper and got published. So there was this kind of two-stage review in that earlier case that I talked about. Okay, let me just jump ahead to, because I only have like 2 minutes left. Oops. I want to talk about the JDE process. Let me go back to that slide. I apologize. Okay, so let me just talk about the JDE and then open it up for questions. A couple of years ago, as pre-results review was sort of exploding in psychology, a number of us at BITS approached journal editors in economics to see if they would be interested in having BITS help them do a pilot for registered reports. And most journals weren't that familiar with it and were a little hesitant to do something kind of radical, or what they viewed as radical, but not the Journal of Development Economics. So Andrew Foster and Dean Carlin are editors. They were familiar with registered reports. They thought it was an interesting idea. And the field of development economics, of all fields in economics, is sort of farthest along in adopting pre-analysis plans. So it was very natural for development economics to try out pre-results review. They launched a pilot March of last year, 2018. In the last year, there have been over 50 submissions I think 5 of them now have gone in principal acceptance. A few of them are coming back with stage 2 reviews already. So there's going to be papers hopefully published soon under this format. And the numbers are rising every month. So there's actually been a lot of interest in development economics in this article format. And the Journal of Development Economics has made this pilot permanent. Now it's just a permanent submission type pre-results review. A second economics journal called Experimental Economics is starting a pilot of pre-results review. So we may start seeing an increase in other fields. A couple of political science journals have done pilots. So this format is starting to spread. So again, just back to kind of the early theme about change, we're in a very interesting time right now. You're taking this training course at a really interesting time because things are changing fast. I think when we had the first few training courses 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking a lot about the problems and saying, oh my gosh, this almost seems insurmountable, but we need to change things. We need to have a community of people get together and change things. And now we're starting to see a number of those changes. So I think it's a cool time for you guys to be joining this community. So let me just pause there and maybe just take 3 or 4 minutes of questions so we stay on schedule. Yeah.
Yeah, so as we think about, I'm going to try to yell. So as we think about switching how we evaluate research from cool results to thoughtful design, engaging with important questions,
Yeah.
there's another piece that I find missing that I unfortunately think, at least in political science, in my experience with reviewers and in what distinguishes papers that place very well from those that don't, is the writing and the argument
yeah.
and the pitch of the paper and what literatures it engages with.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the R&R finds me going back and
Yeah.
re-pitch the paper. And so as I'm trying to think through what pre-results review looks like,
Yeah.
I'm thinking that a paper that has the results that I was expecting from the beginning would be written in a certain way,
Yeah.
and the argument would be pitched in a certain way,
Yeah.
as opposed to a paper that had mixed results to what I was expecting in a pre-analysis plan, would maybe be pitched in different literature, and
Yeah.
would maybe try to offer an explanation for those mixed results that I hadn't thought of beforehand.
Sure.
And so I was wondering how you think about squaring that element of the writing.
Yeah, so I think in economics, at least, this is new. We're just sort of doing the first pilots now, but I've certainly been in touch with the editors of the JDE about the process. I think in the papers that are now coming back for stage 2 review, there has been a lot of rewriting. So this isn't simply the original submission then with tables tacked on. That's not how it is. The editors themselves are saying, wait, you found this set of results which are a little different than we thought. And they're even asking for some additional tests and whatnot that weren't pre-specified to sort of flesh out what's going on. So I think what I've really liked about both pre-analysis plans and now pre-results review, at least in development economics, is people are, I think they're very rigorous in demanding that the initial analyses are shown, but they're not stopping there. They're saying, look, that's a starting point, that's the foundation. We want to see those results, but we also want to write a paper that means something and that we can interpret. So I think we have to be sure not to just take on these activities in a very robotic way. We're scholars, and we, between when my paper was reviewed and a year later, there could be some new results that I want to engage with or a new method that I want to use. And you shouldn't be, constrained from doing that just because of the pre-specification. Show us what was pre-specified, but if you want to go beyond that or reinterpret your results, that's, I think that's fine. That's my own take. Yeah, Apollo?
Yes, I'm wondering the place of pre-analysis pre-registration in laboratory science and investigation. Because when you're doing laboratory analysis, the tendency is to have a pre-designed analytic method.
Yeah.
Same reagents, same method, same temperatures. And if this is going to be fit into this kind of environment, what about plagiarism? Would it be taken as plagiarized?
Yeah, so this issue of, you're saying other people copying others' approaches, or this has been a big concern. If I'm understanding what you're getting at, there's a concern when people register their new idea on a registry that others can then just copy them, what's called scooping them. And And then that feels, like you said, like plagiarism in the sense that if I developed a great idea and I put on the registry, I want to be able to kind of write my paper, but, without someone else, feeling like they're stealing my idea or something like that. Now, of course, in the scientific community, when we share a method, eventually we want others to use it, presumably, but we want to be able to publish our initial result that we've worked on. The way the registries have dealt with these kinds of concerns is they typically have what are called embargoes of, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, where certain documents in the registration are not fully public. So typically, like, the title is public, certain other details are public, but other important details of the method could be held private for a certain limited period of time to enable me to do the research that I set out to do without fear of others scooping the idea. So that's how the AAA registry, the Open Science Framework have kind of tried to balance these concerns of, we do want to share this with the community, but maybe not right away. We'll give people a chance to work on their new creative idea for a couple of years before it becomes public to the community. So maybe that's one way to balance those concerns. More broadly, I personally don't know very much about true like lab science or chemistry or biology science in terms of like biological science, in terms of how pre-specification exactly would work there, because I don't know the methods that well. But my guess is maybe some of the same ideas could be applied, but maybe the methods would dictate some differences. I'm not sure.